Welcome all to this next seminar, which is about housing. We know how to design good and economic housing. What stops us from doing that? I want to thank you all for being here today, and thank Melissa Hoddle and Malcolm Middleton of Brisbane Open House for the invitation to us all to be here. And I'm Antony Moulis. I'm Deputy Head of School Architecture Design Planning at the University of Queensland. And I'm excited and intrigued as you are about what's going to transpire here with the panel over the next hour. Anyway, I wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're actually just at the end of NAIDOC week right now. And so, which is about recognising the history of efforts for greater Indigenous recognition. And it's also about recognising the idea of custodianship of lands. And I think in relation to the urban environment and all environments, the idea of custodianship is a very powerful one. So it's something that's good to dwell on. So I want to introduce the panellists so that we can get into the discussion. So here in the middle is Tessa Leggo, registered landscape architect, especially in urban design for public spaces and working on major projects. She's currently the Queensland Chapter President for the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, which sounds very auspicious, and it is. We've also got Aaron Peters here. Aaron is Director of Vokes and Peters, which is a multi-award winning Brisbane-based architecture practice focusing on housing, public buildings and city making. And also, Rebecca Caldwell, Maytree Studios, who emphasises human first, architect second. So she's putting herself in first and second place there, as you can see.
Yeah. Just ask my husband.
That's good. And with the practice that she's been building over 12 years, it's all about growing sustainably and working with the actual people in the practice in a co-ownership model, but actually doing a lot of liaison with genuine client connection is what Rebecca is into. So please welcome them. So we obviously had a catch up before this, and it was in a Zoom environment or something like that, but we all understood that when coming at this topic, that good design of housing was an absolute value for everyone. But we also agreed that getting a handle on better housing in Australia, we need to look beyond design itself and to look at the issues and factors at play right now in how we procure housing and what affects good housing, what affects it. And so the place of Brisbane and the context of housing really does matter, and that's something that we're going to kind of go over today in the discussion. And those issues and factors are all part of the design problem, essentially, in the end. So we've got a loose format, and we're going to start. I'm going to offer some words about housing context, just to get us going. We're going to look at the housing as a problem. Then we're going to look at small scale and then large scale solutions before we take a broader discussion to kind of wrap up. And because by that stage we will have solved it, you see. We will have got through. Okay, so it's a packed hour, and there's also a very special guest appearance by Bluey. I don't know if you know Bluey, but maybe not. If you've got young ones, you may. But being a panel on housing held in Queensland, you would expect to see Bluey, I'm sure. Okay. The housing context. Just wanted to offer some words here and to say that when we think about housing today, the next word we think about is crisis. There's a housing crisis. And it's constantly in the news. And so the headlines tell the story. And what is that crisis? So it's a crisis of availability. We know that the demand for housing is outstripping the supply. There's a crisis of affordability. The cost of buying or building a house is escalating out of people's reach. And there's also a crisis of accessibility. Considering that, is housing right in suiting different people's needs? And can we afford to go forward just having a one-size-fits-all solution? to the house and housing. So, in looking at how we pursue the great Australian dream of home ownership, there's one thing that's clear. It's a dream that's largely pursued by individuals in a private commercial environment. Indeed, in Australia right now, less than 3% of all housing is public housing. That is government-initiated and provided housing. Okay, so there's only 3% of all the housing that's created in the country. And in contrast, in France, 17% of all households live in public housing, which represents 43% of all renting households. So it's almost half, it's getting up to half of all renting households in France. It's the same as true in the UK. And what we understand of public housing in places like France and the UK is not restricted to low-income households. It also serves a substantial number of middle-income households. So it's an offer that's out there that is calibrated not just to a particular group, but across a group. And so there's an expectation, socially, that there's an offer there in public housing. So there's no right or wrong in comparing the statistics of Australia to Europe in this instance, but it's just an issue of context, and we could choose to change that or not. But that's not the point, I think. But I just wanted to put this image up, which is an overview of Brisbane. We can see the housing there of West End. We can see the city in the background. And it struck me when I showed this shot from a drone that the first thing that came into my mind was, I'm looking at the property pages, or I'm looking at realestate.com. So we've got this very ingrained, embedded idea that housing is about, there's a commercial mindset there when it comes to how we buy and live in houses. That's really just in the background all the time. So coming back towards the ground, coming to the urban environment, how is housing created and what are the problems with how we procure housing today, or some of the issues there? And at this point, I'm going to throw to Aaron to talk about the next part of our discussion. And he's going to brief us a little about, when he gets his paper out, the housing
I thought
problems.
I had a little more time to settle in. I was just getting used to being passive in this situation.
Yeah. Don't get lulled.
Well, thank you, Antony, for the introduction. So, as Antony said, I thought a good place to start today might be just to talk a little bit about the context and trying to start to define what the problem might be with housing. Now, that's a really broad thing. So very quickly recalibrated, and I'm just going to talk about one particular aspect of the problem. So we're going to be talking about lots of issues related to housing and in Brisbane today, but this particular story that I've decided to focus in on is about a particular Brisbane house, just to get the conversation going and to tune us into some local themes. So it's a real house. There's likely to be one just like it on your street. You might even live in one just like it yourself, and you'll almost certainly recognise some aspects of it in the houses of your family and friends. Lots of people would love to live in this house, but I think it's problematic. And architects have a tendency to criticise buildings that they don't like, but because they don't like how they look. And so to be clear, I would like to try and talk about this building without focusing on the aesthetics of the building, criticising it for how it looks, but more to look at what it does, which is slightly deceitful because as an architect I'm constantly judging everyone for how they look, more so than what they do. So I want to try and describe how individual houses in our city shape the kinds of neighbourhoods that we live in. So where are we? Can we, do you mind if I borrow the little clicker, and then I'll spend 5 minutes trying to work out how to use it. Oh no, it's worked straight away, Antony. How about that? So the image on the left I'm not going to say where it is because I don't think that would be very fair, but the photo and the drawing both represent this house in the 1950s, so I was able to dig out an image of it from the State Library archives. So it's a fairly typical 1920s era house, a low-set bungalow sitting about 1 metre above the ground. It would have been entered up a short flight of stairs through an open street-facing porch or veranda. It's a modestly scaled family home with street-facing living rooms, a low boundary fence and a generous garden capable of accommodating a wide range of events and activities and supporting significant vegetation. So this house also would have belonged to a street of similarly scaled, similarly oriented and equally open houses. Today, the house is remarkably changed. The building's been raised and built under. The front veranda is enclosed. Dedicated pedestrian entry like the front stair has been removed. Tall boundary fences have been erected on all sides of the lot. Gratuitous extensions have been added at the rear. New rooms have been inserted into the roof cavity. What little remains of the once generous rear garden will now likely contain a private pool. So, I'm just going to conclude with a few statements, and the images on the screen are some taken from aerial photography of Brisbane in a few different suburbs. And so it's slightly different from my notes, but you can see an aerial photo taken in 1946. There was a citywide survey done of Brisbane in 1946. And then on the other side, you can see the outline of the footprint of the same area of the city taken in 2009, and then another overlay taken in 2024, just a couple of weeks ago. And the hatched parts show the expansion of the footprint of the buildings in that time, which obviously doesn't take into account the fact that most of these buildings are also going to have been built under. So they're probably now, rather than single story, they're 2 stories. So if you compare any Brisbane suburb in 1946 to the present day, you'll see that the footprint of our homes has increased dramatically. If you drive down these streets, you'll start to see that many of the same traits as the example that I showed earlier. So frontage is dominated by tall fences and garages. So what's the problem? Firstly, the massive increase in the size of these buildings does not represent an increase in the number of occupants. In fact, the number of occupants per house is likely to have decreased. Giant buildings mean tiny gardens and no vegetation capable of offering shade. They block borrowed vistas and diminish the scenic qualities of suburbs once characterised by verdant private gardens. Without a garden, there's no place to plant a fruit tree, cultivate produce, sit beneath the stars, throw a ball, take up a DIY task that can't be completed indoors. And rooms below raised houses or stacked upon one another at the rear will be more difficult to passively ventilate. Many will have likely to have poor access to daylighting, so they'll rely heavily on artificial climate control and lighting. And houses of this scale will also contain amenities that once belonged to the public domain. So the municipal pool, the snooker parlour, the cinema, the public bar, the restaurant, all of these things are now miniaturised and replicated as rumpus rooms, media rooms, private pools, or one or more trophy kitchens. Declining patronage for shared civic institutions means that they're often underfunded, or increasingly so. We're less likely to share space, enjoy chance encounters and interact with people outside our social and political bubble. All the living spaces of these contemporary dwellings are highly likely to be situated at the rear of the building away from the street. Tall fences and automatic garage doors mean that many occupants rarely set foot on the street. We're less aware of our neighbours, and walking our streets feels less interesting. They are less vibrant and they often feel less safe. But if people living in them don't care, then what is the problem? So, run out of slides. I think it's this. These houses reflect an appetite for excess fueled by property market metrics that is fundamentally unsustainable. We're consuming ourselves and our planet to death, and the buildings that we're making are major contributors. Houses of this kind also represent a retreat from civic life and an incremental erosion of the role that suburban houses play in growing and sustaining communities. They make us isolated, lonely, and more likely to become disengaged or unconcerned. So that's a little slice of the problem, and I believe now we're going to
we're going to talk about that a bit. So, Aaron, thanks for that exposition. And on a brighter note, we could say that having identified that property as kind of emblematic, we understand that it's not just the issue for that architect and those, the people who commission the work. So that it's a broader problem and it involves government regulation. So I don't know if you want to speak to any of the stakeholders, if you like, the other stakeholders involved in this, and how, about their behaviours and that sort of thing. And
sure. Well, I'll try and be brief because I've already probably spoken slightly longer than I intended. So in many ways, houses of this kind, I think, are emblematic of a broader cultural shift, a kind of underlying set of values that are shifting in our society. So one of the changes that Antony alluded to at the beginning in his introduction was the shift in our collective mindsets, and I include myself in this because I'm a homeowner. As homeowners, we've started to see housing, I think, as an asset rather than a place to live. And that's a really profound shift. And if we want to sort of delve back into our relatively recent history to sort of see where that started to get supercharged, a lot of sources are pointing to the Howard government and the 1999 rolling back of capital gains, which then was compounded by existing negative gearing laws, which started to supercharge house prices in this country. So now when we look at a house, like I keep wanting to say the suburb that house is in, I keep stopping myself, but when we look at a house like the one that I showed, in the 1950s, that was a building that was geared around what people needed from a house and the kinds of pleasures, the sustaining pleasures that a house could offer to a young family. Whereas nowadays, I think you could argue that it tends to reflect the fact that the real estate metrics are starting to drive what we're doing with our homes. So the idea that if you invest in a house, you need to build 3 more bedrooms than you need because when you go to sell the house, you want to achieve a return on your investment. And that just gets everything out of whack.
so, Rebecca and Tess, do you want to respond in any way? Just to what comes to mind, because it is a devilish issue, in a way.
I'll be a bit rude and say greed and fear, things that drive the basic things. And I'm not talking about excessive greed and excessive fear, but when you compound every little bit extra that we take and that we need and that gets sold to us, it takes away from that collective need, the needs of the environment or needs of the other things that need space, money, and attention. So I'm not saying that we're all greedy, but we all have facets of that. So when we want more than we actually need, or what actually facilitates our lifestyle and our community's health. So that can be taken right up through the stakeholders, through our council's need. So their greed, their fear, can they sustain themselves? Do they have enough income? Can they actually support their growing community? Then up to state and then up to federal. So we have that sort of play-off of greed and fear.
Yeah. Rebecca, do you want to respond in some way before launching into small solutions?
Well, yeah, and I think that's not an individual blame thing because you're working within a system that you've got, right? I have a property, I own a home that's improved in equity. And so I think, it's part of the system that you've got to respond to. I think we do a lot of work, I'm sure lots of residential architects do a lot of work working with our clients to figure out what they really need versus what they want and to push back on that impulse to kind of maximise your asset. Yeah.
Thanks, Rebecca. So at that point, what we might do is just roll Rebecca right into talking about small-scale solutions and some of the observations that you're going to make there.
So I am just going to fly through a few little facts that Aaron's touched on, but hopefully you won't be as depressed as you were at the end of his. So between 1911 and 2001, our houses have decreased in size by 2 persons per family unit. The size of solo person homes has increased, and couples with no children has also increased, to the point that that's now solo person households is 1 in 4 households in Australia. And at the same time, we have the biggest houses in the world. What was that, 91, we used to have 50% of homes were 3-bedroom homes. That's now dropped to 44%. And that's not because our houses are getting smaller, that's because now it's normal to build a 4 and 5-bedroom home for your 2.5 person family. And I came across this in The Atlantic the other day it was some really interesting conversation about, why do we think our kids need their own bedrooms? And my 2 boys share their rooms, and we deal with all the ensuing fights and joys of that. But from 1960 to 2000, that went from 0.7 bedrooms per child to 1.1. And there was pros and cons of that, and there's no clear studies that there's benefits or negatives to it, but I just thought it was a really interesting change in society. And then this is some facts around those lone person households and couples without children who have more than 2 bedrooms. So couples without children, about 80% of them have 2 or more spare bedrooms in their home. And then at the same time, this is the only kind of relevant research I could find in Australia, but I found some research in New Zealand where they measured the energy efficiency improvements due to construction improvements from 1970 to now, and then found that the increasing house size had completely negated any energy efficiency gains made in better quality construction. In recapping that, our households are smaller, our houses are getting bigger, the percentage of single-person households is 1 in 4. That blew me away. I had no idea it was that high. Couple-only families are on the rise, and almost 80% of those have 2 or more spare bedrooms, and larger homes are wiping out the energy efficiency gains we're making through better construction. So it's a funny thing as an architect when you think about affordable housing or housing affordability, because there's a sort of real cognitive dissonance there. We work largely, and most residential architects would work largely for affluent people. If they're not personally wealthy, they have a home with equity in it, which gives them borrowing power. So I have done a lot of thinking and working out, okay, what's our position in this, and how do we still deliver what we want in terms of beautiful design work, and that's what a good budget gives you the opportunity to do, but also do it within kind of an ethical framework we feel comfortable with. And I don't have an answer to that, by the way. If you have any hints for me later, come see me. But about 5 or 6 years ago, we did this project that we call Bunk Bed House, and it's a really nice example of a couple of families choosing to do something really courageous and a bit different. So both the 2 families lived in an inner city suburb and lived in apartments, wanted to buy and build in their own suburb, but as individuals, families, that was impossible. They got together and bought a block of land. They bought a very small block of land with a flood overlay, with a slope, with north to the street. So like everything that's difficult to deal with. So one couple had 3 children, and one was a child-free couple with a regular family member who came to stay and thought they might have children. At the time of doing this project, there was actually no legislative support, so we've always been a bit coy about this project. There was no legislative support for this project because you couldn't have more than 5 unrelated persons living in a house. It wasn't defined as a household. That has since changed, since 22, when they changed the granny flat laws here in Australia. And so, yeah, the bunk bed house... Oopsies, that's a laser. The bunk bed house is... So we have the family with 3 children living at the bottom here, the couple with no children living at the top. The couple with no children had access to a small private street front courtyard We planned no fencing and just using some planting to give some privacy, but really keeping it open to the street, because this is the thing they love about where they live, is that interaction and that community. So facilitating that through that connection, and then creating a central courtyard that allowed us to get that northern sun into the centre of the home. One of the couples for downstairs said she wanted to be able to feel winter sun on her feet. And that, I was like, right, south-facing, sloping site, that's going to be a challenge. But we got there. And then this family with the 3 kids located closer to the ground so the kids can access the yard. A couple of floor plans here, so a shared stairwell through the centre, so that gives access to this top. So essentially they're 2 120 square metre units with a shared stairwell and shared roof terrace. So they're probably traded for about a similar size apartment size that they'd moved out from, but they gained a house on a block of land in the community they wanted to live in. They had a really great relationship, but there were lots of really fun, frank conversations about, okay, what's an exit strategy if this all goes wrong, and that kind of thing. They were an amazing group of people. And in terms of, we had a really limited budget, so in terms of achieving the biggest bang for buck, we went with very simple, very robust materials. We treated it a bit like an apartment. There wasn't a whole lot of personal flair put into the interiors of the home, because they could kind of add that over time. And there was also conversation about, at some point, they might interchange about who's on the top bunk, who's on the bottom bunk. So that's just a nice little example of, I guess, what you can gain when you choose what you can give up.
Thanks, Rebecca. And one of the things I think that's brought to mind by what you've outlined there is kind of competing concepts, if you like, of ways of living. And if we think back to the 20th century, the idea of existence minimum, which was a value of 20th century modern social housing, that you only got what you needed. It was about valuing economy of space and construction and simplicity. And of course now there's a lot of faddish interest, if you like, in the aesthetic of that existence minimum, which was, emerged out of Europe at the time. But today it seems that, we're living in a world of existence maximum. We have big houses, as you said, big spaces. We separate a space for everything and everybody, even people who aren't there, as you pointed out. And you told us that the house size is the greatest in the world in Australia. So it'd be interesting to get the comments of other panel members about this existence maximum effect that we're seeing in society, Tess or Aaron? Aaron, go for it.
Sure. So I suppose both of these case studies that we've looked at so far have been talking to this theme of whether or not you allow the housing market to be driven by maximal convenience, maximal quantity, or whether you start to look at quality, smaller scale, potentially embracing the inconvenience of things like sharing a house with another family group. All of these types of things I think are about mindset changes. And Antony, you asked earlier about stakeholders, and I sort of mentioned one, which is householders. But Rebecca brought up another, which is the role of government. And as she said, this is not a project that was incentivised in any way, and indeed potentially prohibited by, say that quietly, prohibited by the local authority. And so I think this is sort of another aspect of like trying to explain how we might address and change and start to shift. One is that we try to reverse what was implemented at a policy level by a federal government, which was in changing housing to being more of a market-driven kind of model. And that can be dealt with through changes in tax law and other forms of legislation. But what Rebecca's demonstrating, I think, is incentivising the shift by demonstrating what the potential of great housing could be. And unfortunately, at the moment, we're very blindly just rolling forward with the idea that, well, to solve the housing crisis, we just need to make more homes. And there's not a lot of conversation about what those sorts of homes might be, because they're going to be with us for a very long time. And if the model is going to be detached houses on the periphery of the city with very little public transport infrastructure or other amenity, then we're just going to be exacerbating this spread and this sprawl and making the same sort of model that served 75 years ago, after servicemen started coming back from the war and there was this original public housing push in Australia. That idea of a block of land and a house is not necessarily how people want to live nowadays, but there's no alternative. And when we're driven by fear, because we're worried about resale and worried about housing being an asset, and we're worried about the fact that we're going to spend the rest of our life paying it off, we're going to be timid about that unless people are willing to take risks, like the clients that Rebecca's been working with. And again, government as a stakeholder has a really big part to play in that. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say in Australia that the initiative is really only being shown in the private sector. And when the private sector, another stakeholder, is also primarily driven by profit, there's very, very few players in the market who are willing to put a model out there to say, here's a slightly smaller or slightly unconventional way of building housing that actually might be incredible. And there's some really interesting stuff happening in Melbourne in particular at the moment, in a multi-res space, which I won't talk about. But there's a role there for projects like the one that Beck's spoken about.
Tessa, do you want to comment on existence maximum?
Yeah, definitely. I might just bring out the scale a little bit and just give you a bit of an indication of what we actually as a society pay for the existence maximum. And I read you an amazing, amazing statistic. So obviously the more we build, the more hardscape, the more roads, the more roof space, more everything, less green space. So that in turn, I'm sure all of you have heard the idea of the heat island effect. If you haven't, that is the measurable increase in temperature in our urban spaces because of that lack of green. So it can be anything. I think when I looked it up, it was about 7 degrees. Most of the research, you get a bit up and down on some of the research, it's about 7 degrees. So even on the same street, you have the exact same street trees make about 4 degrees difference on average, sometimes up to 10 degrees average difference, right? So what does that mean on a societal level when you zoom out and out and out and out and out and out? I'll give you this amazing, amazing, awesome statistic that I was lucky enough to see. There's a group of doctors that are really campaigning around urban design and health. So in 2019, 2020, so there's a few extreme things that happened that year. Deaths from heat were much greater in Australia than all natural disasters combined. So that is 31 deaths from rain and storms, 174 deaths from bushfire, which was high because we had the quite large incidences there, 73 deaths from cold, and 830 from heat. So that's our most vulnerable. That's our pregnant women, our children, our elderly. And then really healthy people that go out and do things in those heat. So, and then the kicker is that because of climate change, whatever that is, so that is projected to increase with urban heat island effect, 200 to 400% in the years between 2031 and 2080. So we're not talking a small amount, we're talking about a major health issue just from one factor alone, from this Maximus idea. So that's what we're paying for, we will all pay for, and that's only one thing that we'll pay for. Sorry, that was supposed to be a solution thing, but but there is a solution, like on that small scale, you know, that block still allows for passive cooling now, whereas the Maximus idea does not. So literally vegetation screening on your east and west, it is as simple as putting in a hedge on your east and west side of your house and a canopy tree on your north. And that's it. That can do your house about 3 degrees change.
Yeah, and size lets you protect and retain vegetation, which just makes our streets so desirable and lovely places to live.
Yeah, I think there's also the, just going from the exterior to the interior of the house, there's a lot of atomisation going on in respect of people's relationship to a screen, you know, watching something. and that, you know, people atomise in their room with their screen, and that creates a kind of multiplier effect on interior space. So, and what we have in the case that you've raised, Rebecca, is where, from a ground-up perspective, people are coming forward with their own perspectives, their own values to put into how they want to live, you know, and are not driven necessarily by, you know, the commercial or some of that kind of, you know, what is it, the public in the home, which is the internet idea. So do you have any reflections on the client, just on this thing that you want to share with us? You know, just client perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that thing of being able to take risks, because everybody around them was saying, well, everyone around you gets concerned and says, oh, like what if someone gets divorced? What if, you know, one of you becomes financially unviable? You know, you're both paying this mortgage. There's a whole lot of risks that are there, and they can mostly be dealt with through a good conversation and a set of kind of, I guess it's an exit strategy, like a director might exit a business. So, yeah, and I think, so it's definitely not a linear process. It's not the same as just going and building your own house. And that's where that factor of having some courage and probably to do something different, someone needs to be the person wearing that risk. Aaron was just referring to Nightingale down in Melbourne, which some of you may know, and if you don't, look it up, it's really interesting. But there was a set of architects who got together to build something different and unique and took financial risk on that project as well. So... but I know they're all very happy, and the child-free couple have since had a baby, and, you know, I just hope I put enough insulation in the floor.
Great. Tessa, can you segue now into your discussion about the large scale? Because obviously heat island effect brings up those issues.
So I'm going to sort of approach this housing sort of discussion on a neighbourhood scale. We can kind of zoom out sort of as far as we want, you know, neighbourhood, community, precinct, suburb, state, region, what have you. But we'll go into the neighbourhood because that's where sort of the urban design starts to shape what we're actually sort of those urban design decisions start to shape what we can actually do. So just through a sort of like a magazine cover, like what if we designed housing for happiness, not for ground floor area, not for profit, not for any of that. Like we just, as Aaron said some time ago before it got monetised, we're designing housing for happiness, okay? So I'm going to use a bit of a cooking analogy just because. So what are the ingredients of a happy community? You know, think of it like a cake. You've got to have the flour, you've got to have the body, you've got to have the physical, spatial things that make that happen, right? So you've got all those things. You've got to have shelter, first and foremost. That's what we're talking about, housing. You've got to have access to community facilities. You've got to have access to transport to be able to do other things. Access to green space is a non-negotiable, absolutely non-negotiable. Stop thinking of it as a negotiable. It is not. And as is health and comfort. So shade, climate, the ability to do that, everything to actually be able to survive. I can't wait to see what the insurance industry does with Western Sydney in 10 years when we have people actually sort of taking them to court because they haven't allowed for this stuff. So they're my ingredients. I've got my butter, which is, I can afford it. You need the glue to stick it together, right? And there's so much more to that, but I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to go into that breakdown of it. But you need to be able to make it affordable for everyone, not just your mate, but the person that earns the least amount of money that you know. So everybody. And then the social desires is my sugar. You know, what makes it something that you want to be in? Not what you have to do, what you want to be in. You're part of that community. You're worthwhile. You contribute to it. The idea of custodianship on NAIDOT Week is incredibly, incredibly powerful. So that's my ingredient list. But I'm going to give you a bit of a case study and just take one, I guess, point of thing around this sort of these two case studies is just distance, the tyranny of just distance on these models. So I've got Yurong Green on the left there, and I've got a housing estate. So what have we got there? So the main physical needs is the housing. So Yurong Green, and I'm just doing what's on their planning. I'm not doing what's being delivered. I'm doing what's on their planning. Is planned for 3,000 people to be able to house 3,000 people. So that's on a 14-hectare site. So I did that on a housing estate. So that's about that same area. And so that, if you assume there's 4 people per household, which I'd say is a fairly average build out there probably, that's 783, I think. Or 732, sorry, math bad. So you're already seeing what you can do for that space. So they both have a park. They both have a shop. And I really want to draw attention to that car park. That car park for that shop, because it's really, and then I'll talk about those walking distances, that's really only servicing about 20 houses or 30 houses in a walking distance that you'd go to the shop, maybe a bit more. Whereas obviously it's so much more in that Yurong-Pilly Green scenario. So talking about those distances, what is walkable? Like if we're trying to create walkable communities to try and make this sustainable, so we're starting to go to that sort of medium to high sort of density. I love 200 metres. Nobody uses 200 metres. I love 200 metres. If you're going to make high density work and you don't have a major public open space within 200 metres, that's not great high density. You know, maybe it's middle density, then you go to 400 metres. Okay, but Queensland government's walkable distance is 1 kilometre. So most planning stuff is 800 metres. So even if you have schools at 800 metres to 1 kilometre, that's still quite okay. But any of those sort of like want to go to the shops or anything, Victoria government puts that at 400 metres. So that's about the distance that it's just as easy to walk as it is to drive. So to me, that's pretty reasonable kind of walkable distance. It's not 1 kilometre. It's not 1 kilometre. And not in the heat of our summer with no trees and no nothing. It's not 1 kilometre. So that's that. But I also want you to consider the cost of that. So just in servicing conduits alone for water and electricity for 700 people versus 3,000 people, you cannot complain about your electricity bill if you think that's okay. Doing 4 times as much space and area in conduiting and servicing and maintenance cost. If we continue with it, we cannot complain about rising costs of our servicing. You just absolutely can't. It's just a no-win situation. And then the cost. I want to do the social and the economic cost. So me and my colleague live in sort of similar scenarios to these 2 scenarios. I live in a suburb fairly similarly distant from our workplace than Yurong-Pilly Green, and I've got a couple of people that live around the same sort of distance in those sort of outer peripherals. So it takes me peak hour, 15 minutes to drive to work. I pay nothing to park because I get to be the boss. So my employees drive minimum of an hour, sometimes an hour and a half each way. Either pay $15 for parking or $8 for public transport. So not only are we seeing them spend 10 hours more a week travelling, they're also paying more to do that. So then we get this inequity in wealth, and we push people further out, and we make them pay more for it. So there's a social injustice thing in there. The solutions. Going back to that ingredients list, you have to have all the things from all the columns. If you're putting elements in your design that are catering for one thing or one column only, then it's not doing enough. I'd even say, so you have to have the physical elements, like your roads and your water-sensitive stuff, they have to be dualling. If they're not dualling, even your physical elements, if they're not dualling, they're not doing enough either. So the more we increase in our urbanisation, the harder everything has to work, which means everything has to be more integrated, which means we have to have better conversations across disciplines, which means you have to have better conversations around the government, the ability to be more flexible and change with this changing environment. We're changing rapidly. Planning takes bloody forever to change. So we need to have that sort of consideration of these changing things. I think peppercorn planning needs to be really looked at. Like, we push light industrial out, which means we make people drive further, you know? So again, we're adding to our problems. And just to leave this, what I consider is probably, I hope, the next major leap in improvements in urban development is the complete integration of green and blue, and that's water and greenery, sort of vegetation. That infrastructure needs to be integrated in all of our urban development in every way it can be. So we keep our water high in our catchment. So that's one, for water quality, and two, the amount of water actually has the biggest impact on your temperature, on the temperature around you. So irrigated turf is better than non-irrigated turf, planting is better than turf, so on and so forth. So both for quality and for temperature. Thank you.
Thanks, Tessa. No, thanks for that. And I was very interested in the idea of the walking distance in particular, just as one aspect, because the idea of the 15-minute city, which comes out of Europe, is in the end very Eurocentric, because it's about a temperate climate. It's about cities in where there is lots of kind of footpaths and places to stop and all that business. So, and it's interesting that here in Australia, we've got the ability to kind of do a landscape-led kind of urbanism, as you say, with a green and blue infrastructure. I just wanted to focus a bit in the panel now on the idea of community housing, because you've raised that, and to say that social housing got a bit of a bad rap in the 20th century, where social housing, institutional housing was starting to be withdrawn, but now community housing has come back as a kind of new type, if you like, and which is somehow different to that. What do you think about the community housing idea in the present, and what its differences are from the past, and why it could potentially take off? Because you're talking about places that are much more living together places.
Yeah, I think it's probably what you guys had sort of already touched on. It's that shared facility. So the privatisation of the pools and everything else retracts you from your community. Putting it back in means that you obviously then have a lot more opportunity to connect with your community. On the small scale, best thing you can do is get rid of your front fence. On this big scale, it's having shared facility. So I'd say you can go anything on that sort of spectrum and range, and you can find a design choice that will facilitate, which is why I had that second column around that social. If you make a design decision that turns your back on any of those social ingredients, then you're doing the wrong thing. If you've got one that considers it, integrates it, and is able to cultivate that sort of social thing, people need to form relationships. They don't necessarily need to know absolutely everybody, but they need to know that they're a part of that. There's a pride in being where you live. So I think that you need to be very, very aware of what your physical design choices are impacting on your social outcome.
You've also implied there, I guess, kind of multi-generational or intergenerational connections, and not the isolation of people at different age groups in certain parts of the city, about what's going on. Do you see opportunities for community that is got that more kind of depth from top to bottom rather than the sort of separation?
Yeah, absolutely. Someone else?
Yeah. Anyone want to comment?
I mean, I think on the individual scale, from my point of view, we're doing a lot more intergenerational housing. So a lot of people are planning for their ageing parents, or they're planning for their children to never leave home, which, dear God.
Ditto.
So there is kind of a bigger range of ages in the houses we're kind of planning for. The front fence thing I think is really interesting, because people are really concerned about security for obvious reasons, but we often talk about the most secure thing you can do is actually take down your front fence, because you subject your home to observation from the street. Lighting is one of the most powerful things to kind of secure your home. And then you do just something very generous back to the street in that gesture, and it's something kind of everybody can do, just pulling that front fence back to the side of your house, and the way that opens and creates a kind of a conversation with the street, and the kids feel welcome to come over after school. It's just a really lovely thing that I think we should all be trying to aspire to.
Even just getting home at 5 o'clock and everyone arrives and you say, hey.
Yeah.
Have we almost done our Bluey episode
Almost,
now?
yeah,
Okay.
we have. We're getting close. Okay, let's get the slide clicker and let's advance.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I'll give that back to you.
So we're going to just open up the discussion now. One of them was about, well, let's just go there.
Yeah.
Here we are. So the Bluey House. So why are we looking at the Bluey House? Well, I was at an event for Future Brisbane, and there was a discussion with the CEO of the Olympic effort for Brisbane, and they'd done a very expensive survey talking to populations around the world, people in cities around the world, about their knowledge of Brisbane. And of course, the response came back: 90% of people didn't even know Brisbane existed, and if they could, they couldn't tell you where it was. But yet everybody knows Brisbane's lifestyle and place values through this wildly popular Bluey cartoon, which is, in America, a third of all the downloads on Disney Plus are Bluey. So that goes to tell you that there's a huge uptake, and this is probably the most famous house in the world at the moment amongst children of under school age. And they think it's a fantasy. But for anyone with young children, they know Bluey is a documentary. It is a documentary. And so what do we do with this fact? Because what Bluey highlights, with very fastidious detail, we all know that, people who've watched it, you understand that it's Mount Cootha. It's very fastidious in the detail, but it's highlighted a lifestyle in a kind of benign subtropical environment. It highlights the relationship between inside and outside space, connections with nature, people living in a neighbourhood, interacting in a park, this sort of thing. So how do you think these recognisable values can be brought forward without simply idealising it as a kind of, image of the house as we go?
Well, what I would say is I think Bluey is, to a certain degree, it's nostalgic, but it's also very optimistic, and I think that has to be the way forward. So I spoke earlier about some of the changes in capital gains and negative gearing that sort of set a ball in motion at the end of the 1990s. Bill Shorten went to an election against Scott Morrison a few years ago looking to reform negative gearing, and he lost very unexpectedly because of a fear campaign that came from the government at the time, which got everyone worried about the value of their houses, because we're all, me included, so invested in how much we've spent to buy these houses that the idea of our house prices going down is actually terrifying. That's a fear response. And if we look at all the different obstacles that we've talked about today, the resistance to the solutions, which we all know about, we know how to make great housing. We did it 100 years ago. We did it 200 years ago. We've been doing it for millennia. We know how to make really great cities. That's not the problem. The problem is political will. The problem is optimism. The problem is cultural shifts and societal push to embrace the opportunity of how great our cities could be. And Bluey is an example of that. Now, we can't necessarily do it with big blocks with generous gardens and detached houses. We have a land scarcity that probably prohibits that now. We're also worried about letting the kids walk to the shops on their own because something might happen. They might have to cross a road. Fear is an obstacle again and again to these things. But what we need to start focusing on is the dangers in continuing the course that we're on, which is turning ourselves and our homes inward, backing away from the idea of engaging with streets, engaging with neighbours, engaging with communities, because the end game there is that we live through a device, and the only way that we experience these amazing things that we see on Bluey is downloading it on Disney+. We're now experiencing the childhood that you probably had. I know that I did. I'm guessing that you guys would recognise a lot of your childhoods in Bluey. Our kids are experiencing that via a TV show rather than actually doing it as much as we did. It still exists, but it's diminishing and it's becoming transformed into something completely different. So we need to recognise what's happening to us, and we need our governments to be positive, optimistic and brave like they were at the end of the Second World War when we built 300,000 social houses in 10 years. And we as a voting public and concerned citizens also need to be brave by spreading that message and voting optimistically rather than as a fear reaction.
Yeah, look, blue is an identity. You know, it is definitely our character identity of our place. I don't think you have to diminish your character identity to be able to get better outcomes that we've been discussing like this. I think one of the ones that I'm just going to bring the conversation back to government and planning and some of that impact, the cul-de-sac. That wasn't allowed for a long time because the planning sort of went, actually, no, we don't want cul-de-sacs because that's unsafe, you know. And then we have we're trying to get a bit of density. So townhouses come and they start to go, think, oh no, can't have townhouses because there's fear and there's problems with those sort of things. There's fire and there's other things. So these brave decisions end up, or these great tools in our belt to do some of these things around these identity and create these places that are interactive, then get dumbed down to the lowest common denominator of what's safe for government to advocate for or to legislate. So we've boiled it down to the lowest common denominator. Then we don't have anything else that is able to be delivered because going outside the box is actually really difficult. You know, it's time consuming, which is money. And so then people don't want to go there. So we are seeing a little bit of more innovative-ish planning with the Krupa plan and with the GABA PDA that's coming out. We're starting to see some more nuanced planning approaches around the neighbourhood scale of things, not just your local area plan, but just a little bit more precinct-based design and understanding around that planning. But that is very Brisbane, very urban-centric, very much these are starting off things, and should only be just considered like your base model now. That should be what we're doing everywhere. We've got a lot of other council areas that are experiencing massive growth without the benefit of really big engines in their council. So to get this for everyone, maybe it's an identity thing, not necessarily a product.
Yeah. Rebecca, do you want to comment on the Bluey effect?
Well, I think I'm living the Bluey effect. My partner and I bought a house in Hurston last year that was a 2-bedroom house, and I was just telling these guys earlier, we had a lot of people going, oh my God, you can't move into a 2-bedroom house. Very concerned about us as a family. And we did have to cull a lot of stuff, which is great. But we're kind of in moving away from what was a busier street to a quieter street, traded into a smaller house. We have more land. The kids run across the road and ask their schoolmates. We live nearer the school, so we're closer in proximity to the school. So there's just more crossover, there's more community, and it does mean I have to clean out the toy box every 6 months to make it viable, but it's worth it. It's a really, it's a good trade-off.
Excellent. I was just going to look back now at housing, get another couple of observations from the panel. And in this image, which we see just a view over, regular Queensland houses, just noticing over in this corner a project that I worked on with Form Architecture and Design and Sylvia McCallie, which is One Room Tower, which is sitting here. It was a detached extension, so it's a building element that doesn't touch the house in any way. It's on a corner, so that piece of extension can access the street separately if it was occupied by other people or some other activity. And so, again, in looking at how to develop the block, the classic thing to do would have been, as what Aaron said, is to lift the house, build under, but we understood that was going to certainly create problems of ventilation, as Aaron said, and other things, and also you couldn't get that sort of porosity of the ground, which, because the ground is open underneath. So it's just this idea about diversity. So as you were talking, Rebecca, about how legislation changes. So with the granny flat legislation changing, we were no longer in a position that blood relatives had to be occupants of that tower. You know, it could be leased to others because a housing crisis was called, and therefore, quick, granny flats, yes, let's make anybody stay in them, you know, that's okay. So it was a bit of a reaction, but it sort of started to change. So I just wondered what comments you might have about the opportunities for diversity of housing, you know, diverse options which may not fit the property paradigm, if you like.
Well, maybe a personal anecdote from me. So when we moved out of an apartment building in West End, which we really loved living in, we had a one-bedroom apartment there, and then we had a child, and the math just didn't quite stack up anymore. I think we thought we'd get a couple of years out of it, and then within a few weeks we were sleeping on the living room floor. And we were forced out of that building. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't want to buy a house and land, actually. I really wanted a little garden where we could, you know, plant some veggies and do all of those kind of good things. But unfortunately in Brisbane, there's detached houses and there's multi-res, and there's actually very, very little in between. There are some townhouses around, but particularly in the inner suburbs, a lot of the character legislation prevents our suburbs from evolving and developing what is commonly called in planning parlance the missing middle. So housing that might be somewhere between living in a huge tower and somewhere between living in a house. Now, if we had a better balance in our housing mix, and we also started to think a little bit differently about houses, we might end up with less scenarios where we have one or two occupants living in a 5-bedroom house, and families crammed into small apartments, and we might start to be able to shuffle the board around a little bit more. So, you know, in that, and if housing wasn't so unaffordable as well, and so many barriers to shifting where you live, we might have been able to transition into a 2-bedroom place, and then if we had another couple of children, we might have moved into a slightly larger place, and then when our kids leave home, we move into a smaller place again. Unfortunately, what we're doing is we're spending our life savings and then some on getting a foothold in the market and then just clinging onto it desperately because we know that it's worth so much, that kind of fear response again. So I think that that's one of the things we really need to start thinking about is models like the house that you've set up where, yes, you've extended the house for the peak period of your family when you're 2 girls and you and Sylvia are living in the house, and the house needs to work really hard to keep everyone happy and have enough space for growing children. But when the girls move out...
3 girls.
Oh, 3 girls, sorry. Yeah, 3 girls, of course. But when the girls move out, you might move into the tower and one of them and their partner might take over the house, or you might rent it out to someone else, or you might potentially be able to subdivide and live in the tower. You know, so there's so many more options, so much more flexibility built into that building. The same is true of the bunk bed house. That's a really flexible, robust building. Again, we know how to do these things. There's lots of intelligence in the design community within Brisbane and in the planning department at Brisbane City Council. It's just the political will and the bravery to unlock it, to allow us to...
Yeah, I would also say be really, really thoughtful about how long you need those extra bedrooms for. So I've got kids that are growing up. We went from a share room to a room each, so built in the dining room. So everyone's got a bedroom each, except me and Nav. You know, we have to share. That's a bummer. But they're growing up. They are needing more space, but it's for 5 years. 5 years. I am not spending $500,000 on another 2 bedrooms and then another complete sort of footprint of my house again to put it on top that I have to clean and deal with for 5 years.
You can pay someone to do that.
I can't allow myself to do that. I still feel like I should, even though I don't.
It's more than $500,000.
Yeah, and that's it. It's like $600,000, I think, to replicate. Sort of, we were in those old worker cottages, so it's a tiny, tiny footprint. So we're just making do, you know, like, yes, I desperately want another bathroom and a toilet, get there. But just building in an office downstairs in the garage. So that'll do us for a couple of years, and then we'll see where we're at. You know, I just do not need a 5-bedroom house for the rest of my life. Can I survive 5 years with, yeah, it's actually, this sucks a bit, but, you know, we'll cope.
I really like what you said there, Aaron, about the fluidity, like, of housing options rather than this tightly held thing. Because, yeah, the growth and then being able to retract easily, that's what doesn't exist. And it's, I think, something like the project you're showing there, Antony. You know, we have a contingent of mature women with very limited economic choices in Australia. So more of that kind of option is great.
There is an ageing in place conversation too that needs to happen.
Yes, no, absolutely. And yeah, in
That's
inner
the
city
next.
communities, you can see that in place. You can see that ageing community happening and people being in touch with others, you know, younger people being in touch with older people just in the street and that sort of thing. So that, yeah, there's a real value to that. We're getting to the conclusion of our session. We might just ask for any burning questions from the floor. A couple of those before we wrap up. So here.
That was great, thank you. I really enjoyed that. First of all, I feel compelled to defend couples with no children that have 3-bedroom homes. We use both of our spare rooms as offices, so I just need to clear that up. But Rebecca, I was just wondering, so the bunkhouse looks amazing, and I totally agree that's the way of the future, that more flexible housing and maybe multi-family use, particularly for the ageing homeless women population. Is there any reason financially council would be against that type of thing? Like, do they make less money out of something like that? I can't see how that would be an inhibition to it. So what's stopping them?
Yeah, so it used to be the definition of a household in Queensland legislation, which has been changed, which is a great first step. No, I can't see from a council perspective, other than overcrowding and not having shonky operators running essentially like a boarding house and unlicensed boarding house or something like that. I think that's what the definition of the household was, trying to limit that kind of an issue. Yeah.
Thanks. Over here, another question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I want to pick up on the excellent point around political will. In a sort of media and political environment where political campaigning is dominated by conservative residents groups or opposition to development, what is the vehicle to convince decision makers that this is the way forward? What does a pro-urban advocacy and campaigning system in Australia look like?
Yeah, look, the answer is that it's lots of different things, and as in all things in a democratic system, it's messy, and it probably involves a lot of setbacks and a lot of wasted energy. So, that's probably not a very satisfactory kind of answer, but unfortunately it is the way, and I think the conversation is starting to change. I think that's really clear. I've been seeing a number of articles recently challenging a whole bunch of assumptions about, for instance, character controls in suburbs. So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that seemed like a wonderful revolutionary thing to do to preserve our shared heritage. Well, unfortunately, we've failed in preserving our heritage, and we've also stymied any opportunity to redevelop the inner suburbs of Brisbane in a way that actually allows flexible housing, that actually allows diversity of use, a whole bunch of different things. So these things are just so complex that it's always going to be a struggle. We're always reacting against the last screw up that we made to try and fix it for the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And the only way to do it is just to keep talking, keep coming to things like this, keep putting yourself out there and your views out there and listening to other people and getting feedback and adjusting your view and trying to find new pathways. I'm afraid I don't have a silver bullet. It's just more of this, unfortunately. And people know, people in government know, bureaucrats know, planners know, even politicians know. It's just about giving confidence, calling up your local member and saying, I'm concerned about this. Because at the moment, we talked about different stakeholders, politicians want to get re-elected. And at the moment, the last message that the Australian people sent to the ALP, for instance, was you need to go into the next election with a Ming vase election strategy, which is do not rock the boat. Don't drop the vase. Don't say anything stupid about negative gearing or electric cars because you will lose. So the ALP won the last election by essentially having a very tread lightly, softly approach to housing policy, and yet we urgently need change. It's not that they've forgotten all those good ideas that they had, it's that they don't feel like the voting public will support them. Well, we have to let them know that we've had enough. We have to change. We need them to lead.
Rebecca, you've got something
And I
to...
think the design community, that responsibility of the design community to demonstrate what these outcomes can look like and to articulate them really well to the public. That's probably one of the missing pieces. And I think we naturally do the not in my backyard thing. You know, we naturally resist things much more easily than we lobby for something we haven't seen yet. So I think there's work to do there.
Tessa, yeah.
I do a lot of advocacy to government, so part of my role on AILA, so that's the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects. Obviously there's our sister sort of professional industry is AIA, and then PIA and DIA, so that's the planners, designers, architects, landscape architects, they're our main design professionals. That's one of our main things, is to advocate for government for things that we want change in. So we write a templated letter for council elections, for state elections, for federal elections. We try and encourage people to do the same, to submit it, because you will only get it if you're quite loud. So what we don't benefit from is money. So we are volunteer organisations. These are things, we do these things on a voluntary capacity. So when you are up against other lobbyists and other things that have a financial interest to not achieve that, then you are up against something that is better facilitated than you are. So I would say that everybody has a role in being able to be a voice, be able to be a champion for change, and sort of put your time where your mouth is, less so than your money, because your time is so valuable in being a champion for good design.
But I think that message needs to be clearer and louder from the institutes. I think they write the letters, and then that's...
Well, we've actually had a little bit of success. I might just toot the horn.
Yeah.
So we've been working very hard on joint advocacy, because we're finding we have much better, we're gaining better traction when there's the group of us together as a combined voice. So we have an advocacy piece out at the moment, so gold places, green pathways, might be the wrong way around. And that's around advocacy for the Olympics. And so we have met with all the DGs, all the directors, some of the ministers, wasn't the Premier at the time, the Deputy Premier, to try and champion those things. And while we might not get our little thing and tick box say, yes, you get to have all those things that you're asking for, what we're hearing is it's actually affecting some of the policy, some of the things that have been driven in the state government sort of circles, planning sort of stuff. So it's really, really exciting, but it takes proper commitment, and it takes a lot of people and a lot of time. It is not just one person. It is a bucket load of people.
Yeah, and I think that as we wrap up now, I just wanted to say that certainly the issues that have been highlighted, the crisis about availability, affordability, accessibility to housing, are all important things to acknowledge. But I think what we've got out of this is that one thing that is absolutely true is that we're all in this together. And collaboration and this kind of some genuine discussion is needed. And genuine discussion means, oh, I'm happy to change my mind because I've heard something that impresses me, or yes, I see something different. And so I think in this case, changing one's mind is not that bad an outcome. So thank you all for attending, and please thank the panel for their discussion.